everyone, welcome back to the React in-depth series. In this video, we're going to go over data fetching in React together. This is one of my favorite topics. It's always really fun to be able to go outside to an external system like some kind of server or some kind of API and get some kind of cool data and then work with the inner apps. Traditionally, when we're kind of working and learning with these new frameworks, it's a bit quote unquote boring when you're using your own like p tags with random text in it and h1s with text in it and things like that. So it's going to be kind of nice to actually get some data that looks a bit fresher and a little bit more real world like when we're actually dealing with systems that are external to us, even hosted by different companies or different third parties or even our own servers that we write together. So this video is going to be all about data fetching. There's quite a few topics to go through when it comes to data fetching in React, and I'll point out some of the kind of caveats that go along with this centralized idea of fetching data in React. But let's just kind of take a look at this, get started with a kind of introduction, and then we'll go through some examples together and those caveats, and then we'll go through a bunch of exercises in the next video following this one up where we can actually get some real world practice with how to actually fetch data from an API, in this case, a REST API, everyone's favorite one, the Pokemon API coming up after this. So let's take a look together. So to start, I just want to kind of start with an overview of what data fetching is in React and what I mean by this idea in general. So components in React, as we know them, as we've been building them, are function components. They can access data from anywhere, technically. And when I'm talking about data fetching, I'm talking about getting data from some kind of data source that's outside of our front end that we're building in React. Now, this is a bit tricky because technically these days you can actually use React on the server, which we haven't covered in this course together. There are some really cool, funky, advanced things you can do over there, but that's a bit beyond the scope of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about data fetching in React. I might try to point out a few of the differences that we're talking about when we see a client side versus a server side data fetching and rendering and things like that. But for the most part, this video is going to be focused on client side data fetching, which is the most traditional way that you'll see it being used in React, at least. What this allows us to do is we want to be able to control the view, which is our component, and what it displays out to the DOM, depending on what data we have from our system that we're interfacing with, right? So like, for example, if we have like a personnel card or some kind of person or a list of activities or time slots, or in this case that we'll look at later, some Pokemon cards, we want to be able to kind of control what shows on the screen depending on those different results that come back from the server. So that means we need to know quite a lot about how that server actually formats the data so that we can actually use it on our front end. The other thing we need to keep in mind is how to handle errors gracefully. This is something that's skipped quite a lot, and I want to make sure we spend a bit of time in this video on it because it's super important. Our front end is going to display absolutely nothing except a bunch of errors in the console if we are not careful with how we deal with our errors gracefully inside our actual components. So we do want to make sure that at the very least, the users of our application can actually see error messages that are formatted by us to give them a bit of an idea that, hey, maybe something's going wrong right now, maybe the server is down, maybe try again in a few minutes. All right. Now, just to start again, I want to give an overview of data fetching in general and what this idea even means if you haven't seen this before. I have a similar thing in the Fetch API introduction that we look at in the JavaScript series together. So this is just kind of a much faster overview of this idea. So when we're thinking about this entire video, I want you to think like this. Basically, we have a component over here. So in this case, I have, for example, a home component. And what I mean by data fetching is that this component is going to actually talk to another external system somewhere else. Now, somewhere else, I'm being purposely vague about that. That could be in another country, it could be in another continent, it could be in another city, it could even just be next door to us on a local network. It could even very well be the same computer, which is actually what we're doing when we're doing React dev servers locally on our machines. We're serving files from our own computer. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that we are going to try to communicate with some external system, and that system is going to give us some kind of response. So the order of kind of operations here is we're going to make a request from our component to some external system, like in this case, a server. That server is going to listen for that request and then do something regarding those instructions. So for example, in this case, we have some kind of format for how we're communicating. This is a typical REST API format where we're making a GET request to this endpoint. And we're saying, hey server, like get me the data number 3, right? From your database or however you're storing your information. And the server is like, okay, cool. Like I'll go and find that for you. And we're going to get back a response. So over here, I have tagged as JSON, which is a very typical style of response that we'll get and something that we're very familiar with when we're working with data in JavaScript. It's a very nice notation. Most APIs use notation. However, by any means, there's many different types of responses that we can get. JSON is by no means the only one. We could get back text, we could get back web pages, we could get back other types of protocols, use other types of data structures that we could get back. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to mainly focus on the most traditional one, which is JSON, and we're going to interface with that through React. So our component is going to be built so that when it loads up, when it mounts, we're going to make a request out to some third-party server somewhere, maybe even our own computer, but some system. And that is going to take some amount of time. This is really the key point. This request is not instant. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to travel and send information faster than the speed of light. So this is going to take some amount of time, even if that amount of time is a few milliseconds, nanoseconds, or even seconds if it's really, really far away. So that's going to come back, and that's also going to take some amount of time, right? So if you think about this, this kind of makes sense, right? Our component might run right away so that we can render something to the screen as fast as JavaScript allows us to do that. However, this communication takes some amount of time. And kind of hint, hint, nudge, nudge here, that's going to be this idea of promises most of the time, right? So we're going to make a request, we're going to get back a promise, and then that server is going to respond back with either like some kind of error or a fulfilled, resolved, rejected promise, something like that, right? And the key thing is that this is asynchronous, whereas our components and the rendering of our components for the most part is synchronous. So we need to figure out how to manage both of these ideas so that we can get data, but still have our components displayed to the screen in a timely manner. So let's get started with this and see why this presents some challenges when we're actually looking at our components. So let's start with this idea. Imagine I have a very simple component here. So this component is called home. And we'll code this out in a second together so we can actually see like live examples of this working. But imagine that we have this component. I have basically 2 lines of code inside this component. The first one is I'm assigning to a variable called data the result of using the fetch API on some URL. Okay, now ignore the fact that this URL is not really a valid URL, just pretend it is for a second. It can be any URL, it doesn't really matter. The point here though is that we're going to get back something in data, and then we're going to return back a paragraph with data inside of it. Okay, so I want you to pause the video if you get a chance here and try to think to yourself before kind of looking ahead or testing it yourself. If you were asked this, like what is data going to be in this case? All right, so let's go through this together. Fetch is an API that's available to us on most JavaScript systems, for example, in the browser and even in things like Node.js and other browser engines. And we're going to get back from fetch a promise, and that's going to be stored inside of the variable data. We're going to try to return a promise inside a p tag. Now, if you recall back to our JSX introduction, when we were first looking at React for the first time, this doesn't really work for us, right? Because JavaScript, or in this case, React, is not expecting there to be this weird object, a promise, inside of the JSX. We want there to be like strings or maybe even an array of JSX elements or some kind of numbers, maybe even Boolean values. Those all work fine. But what does it mean to put an object, especially something so kind of random like a promise inside of our DOM? Like how would we visualize that? So this is not going to work. Right? So let me show you what I mean really quick, and then we'll keep going with this. And if you're looking at this and be like, okay, Netter, I kind of get it. Like, of course, this is not going to work. Bear with me because it's super central to understanding how promises work and asynchronous issues actually arise. Going through this flow of data is really, really central to making that understanding click. So I'm going to open up VS Code here. I'm going to run npm create v@latest. And while that loads up, I'll just do this really quick now. I'll do, we are doing, I guess I'll just call this async. I don't know why I call it async. I probably should call the name of the video. I'll choose React there. I'll choose JavaScript. I'll cd to async, and then I'll run npm install. So while that's installing, I'm going to switch back to Chrome over here, and I'm going to pull up an API that we're going to be using. Always funny to see the trending search results. Very, very random. I'm going to search for the Pokemon API. Okay. And when you search that, hopefully one of the first results is going to be pokeapi.co. Awesome job these folks have done to set up a nice RESTful API and more recently actually a GraphQL API. I hope to make some series on that in the future. I'm going to go to that. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So this is our RESTful Pokemon API. We can make queries to this for free as long as we're respectful of their limits. But let's take a look at how this works. So I want to be able to query for a Pokemon here. So for example, they're giving a demo of searching for Ditto. Here is a link for Ditto. So I'm just going to right click and I'm going to copy that link and have that ready for myself so that I can actually use that as an example. And we can see here what this results are going to look like if we were to do this query. In fact, I can even open that up really quick in a new tab. You can see this is really ugly. If you have Firefox installed or some kind of extension, this will look much, much nicer. There are Chrome extensions like JSON viewers and things like that. I think I just use Firefox for a lot of other things like this or other third-party tools. But you can see that this is just a very kind of hard to read, not formatted version, but it's all just JSON. You can see that this is curly brackets here, and then there's keys and values all through there. And then this is the nicer formatted version of that. If we collapse these, you can see that these are all just nested, and we can have different bits of data through the keys and values in here, and we can access them all quite nicely. So if I switch back here, looks like that's done. I'm going to cd to async. Async. Did I not spell that right? No such file. Oh, I'm already in the folder. There we go. I don't know. I forgot that I'm in the folder. Wow, craziness. I'm going to run npm run dev. And I'm going to get my URL right here. I should probably actually copy this. I'm going to lose my other copy. I'll go to a new tab here and I'll paste that in. Let me just zoom in a whole bunch so that we have some very clear views for everyone as to what we're seeing. Open up my console and my elements tab, zoom in a bit more on that, and then we're good to go. I'm going to go back here and recopy this URL right here since I just lost that. And I'm going to come back to VS Code. I'll go into my source folder, I'll go into app and I'll open that up, as well as main, and I'll open that up. I can also close my side terminal here just so we have a bit more space. Inside main, I'm going to get rid of index just to get rid of that formatting from the styles. I'll get rid of all of this stuff as well up from app. I'll get rid of all this stuff from app, and I'll get rid of everything in here from app. So if I go back to my slide, let's see if we can get this working. So the only thing we're going to change is the name. I'll just change it to app for now. But I want to make a fetch request out to this API. So let's follow this exact series of steps and see what we get. I'm going to say const data is equal to making a fetch request out to, I'm going to paste in this URL. Okay, so we're going to grab Ditto's information from this API that we just copied, that we saw the results or a sample of those results on their web page. Then I'm going to return from this a set of JSX in a p tag, and I'm going to put in this data. Now, in my mind, what I would like the computer to do, or React to do in this case, is kind of like what you probably would expect, like as a human being looking at this, which is that please go and get the information, right, from this data source, which is on some server somewhere in the world. And when you get that back, like just display it here inside the p tag. Simple as that, right? It seems so simple. Very similar, if I switch back to Chrome, very similar to what we're displaying right here, right? Like if you look at this, that's kind of what I would kind of expect. Maybe it's a bit uglier looking, maybe there's no formatting, but I would expect to kind of see at least that data logged out there, right? So let's see if I can import this into my main. It's already in my main. I forgot that I didn't change the name. I'll switch back to Chrome, switch back to my React app, and I'll just refresh the page just so we're making sure we're getting all the latest data. And look at what we get. We get an uncaught error. Objects are not valid as React child. Found an object of type promise. If you meant to render a collection of children, use an array instead. So basically what React is telling us here is, hey, you gave me a object to try to render out, and this is a promise object, and I don't know how to do that. So this is actually very similar. Let me just really emphasize this because it's really important. This is very similar to, for example, let's just say I say name of Ditto. And I have to put this in curly brackets here because this is an object in JavaScript. So I'm saying, please put an object inside of this p tag and then return that to render out to the screen. And if I reload this page, you'll see that we basically get a very similar error, right? We see objects are not valid as React children, found object with key name if you want to render blah, 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 right? So it's saying, please don't give me an object. I want to see actual values in here. So instead of something like this, I would expect to see, maybe something like that. And if I did that, and I go back here, we would indeed see that show up, right? Which makes sense because that's just text. So that's the issue. But our issue is even worse because actually this takes some amount of time. Okay, so I'm going to put that back in here. I'm going to comment this one back in. And let's take a look at how we might fix that. I would like you to think for a second, what are some things you could do that might make this work? Okay. All right, so I'll switch back to my slides here, and I have one example of one thing that you might do. We know that this is a promise, and we don't want to display the promise data in there, so maybe we'll wait for the promise to resolve, and then we'll get that data that comes back, and we'll shove that inside of the p tag, right? The problem with this is that this is still a promise, right? When we get this back, this is still a promise. So technically, actually, what we could do is we could set data equal to the value that comes back and try to render that out. But that is still going to give us a promise within this p tag, right? So let me show you what I mean. I will do data dot then, and I'm going to get back I guess I'll just say the response, and I'm going to just return that response right away. In this case, not even using it. Or I could say data equals to response just to show that that is still not going to show. But if I come back in here and I refresh, this is the same exact problem as before. We have a promise inside of there. So to show you something though, I want to go to the network tab, and I'm going to pull that up, and I'm going to scroll up here, and I'll refresh the page. And what we'll see is it's kind of cut off here, but we'll see that there is indeed a request going out. My face is always in the way, always in the way here. But you can see that there is actually a request going out here, right, where my face is covering to this API, and we are getting kind of the response, right? So that is happening. It's just not being displayed on our screen. And React is not happy with the fact that we have a promise object inside of our JSX. Right? This is no bueno. This is no good. We have a promise inside of here. We need to figure out how to turn that into actual like a string or set of numbers or something to put it in here. So let's see some other options we can do. One thing we could probably try is make the whole thing an async function. We can make the whole component async function. Maybe we can await it, and then we could return that data. Right? In theory, this would probably work if we were allowed to do this, but you're not allowed to do this in React. You can't make async functions because React needs to be able to display something in that tree at that spot synchronously as it's going through its render loop. And this is just something that's not allowed. Now, in the future, maybe we can do some fancy stuff with async functions if React goes down that way. There are some APIs that they're adding to allow this kind of behavior, not exactly this, but this kind of behavior with things like suspense and other things like that, but that's a bit different than exactly what I'm mentioning here, but the same kind of concept. So this is not allowed. We can't do this in React. So let's take a look at another kind of a view we can do here. So we could probably say, okay, we need a useEffect. Okay, maybe since we know that effects are side effects of components, and normally when you talk to something that is outside an external system, we would use an effect because it's a side effect of our component. So maybe in that effect, what we can do is we can reach out and we can grab that data, and then we can put it inside of data, and then we can render it out. Now, I already kind of hinted at the bottom of the slide what the issue is, but let's take a look at this in action. So I'll switch back here, and I'll come back up here, and I'll import useEffect from React. And what I'll do is I'll cut this just so that I have that saved, and I'll change this to a let because we're going to be reassigning this. This is just the same thing as let data equals undefined. And in here, I'll put a useEffect, and in that useEffect, I will say data is now equal to reassigning it to getting this, and then I will do a .then where I will get the response, and then I will just I will kind of like set it as the response, or technically here I should put data is equal to this inside of here, but this is not going to work regardless, so I'll leave it at that for now, and I will put this in here. Okay, so conceptually, like this is what I would probably be thinking. And I forgot to put that I want to make sure that this only runs on mount. I don't want this to run on every single re-render. In this case, we don't have state in this component, but if this was part of a tree of components and our parent component re-rendered, we don't want to run this every single time this app component gets mounted. We want to be very careful with that because we only need one fetch request. So what we're saying here is please, when this component mounts, go out and fetch this data, get the response, and then kind of set it to be data. In this case, I probably should put data equals response here, but it's not going to work regardless. So I'll save that. And I'll come back in here and I'll refresh the page. And what we'll see is, okay, well, interesting. There's no more error, right? The error went away, but there's also nothing there. We have an MTP tag now, so that's interesting, right? There's something there, whereas nothing was there before. But what does this mean, right? Why is it empty? Why there's nothing in there? Well, what's happening here is, if you think about this, this makes sense, right? We are saying let data equal undefined. This runs asynchronously. All useEffects run asynchronously and get scheduled to run off to the side of the component. They don't interrupt the render. So we run this right away. We schedule this to run shortly, and then we run return P of data. What is data? Well, data is undefined. So we're actually doing this. We're saying return P of undefined. Actually, this is technically not what we're doing. We're doing this of the value undefined, which is actually rendering nothing in that place, just like null. Okay. So what's happening here? Hopefully, you're starting to see kind of the pattern that we're going. We want to be able to tell React, hey, data has come back. Right? This is no longer undefined. This maybe started as undefined. That's totally fine. And it's okay to render it as empty to start. But after it comes back, please put that in data so that we can re-render and put that in here. I want you to think, what tool do we have to allow a component to store some data and then re-render the component when it comes back? All right, so hopefully I gave enough away there. This is one way that we would approach that, right? Pretty much exactly what we just did. The only difference is we would use state instead of just a regular variable inside of components, because we know that React keeps track of this and checks to see if it's been changed through the setting function, and then we'll actually re-render that component with that data. So let's take a look at how this works. So to start, we're going to pull in useState as well. And I'm going to kind of change this to be data and then set data. Probably const is better, but I'll leave it as let just to keep it the same for now. And this is going to be useState. It's going to start off the same, undefined, null, doesn't really matter. We'll just keep it as something that is not a value, okay, to start. And now I don't want to set data directly like this, because with state, we need to use the setting function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that, and then that response, I'm going to take that response and I'm going to pass it to set data. So instead of just getting the response directly like this, I'm going to say set data of that response. Okay, just like that. That's going to probably reformat on my screen to move all the way over there. I should probably put this in brackets so it's a bit more clear to everyone what is exactly happening. There we go. So that's really what's happening, right? This is a function that's going to run after this fetch request comes back and that promise resolves or rejects. In this case, this is the resolve case. We would get back that response and then we can do something with it. So I'm going to set data to that response. So let's see what happens. I'm going to switch back here. I'll reload the page and well, nothing happened. Do we have any errors in our console? Okay, so now take a look at this. We have objects are not valid as React child, same error as before, but now it's no longer a promise. We have an object response. Okay, so the reason for this has to do with the fact that this particular API responds in JSON. So we need to actually format this in JSON so that it actually works. And we know previously that we can basically do this in two ways. We can say return response here, response.json like that. And we can chain another .then onto here. So we can say .then, then we're going to grab that JSON. And then we're going to set data to that JSON. If this is confusing to you, take a look at the Fetch API video. The way that the Fetch API actually works is it returns a response object, and it doesn't assume anything about it because we can have other types of responses that are not JSON. Where we have to tell it in this case, hey, this is JSON. Please parse it as JSON using like JSON parse, and then give me back that promise once you're done with that, and then I can have the actual data value. So if I save this and that formats it a bit nicer, you can see that chain here. We make the request, we get back that response, which is the raw response. Then we can take the body of that response, pass the JSON parse using this helper function. Then we can .then and grab that next promise, which is the actual string value itself. So now if I come back in here and I reload the page, we can actually see that we're getting closer. Objects are not valid as a React child, found objects with keys, but look at this. Now we have the actual keys in there, right? So let's take a look at this. Before we set data to JSON, I'm actually gonna console.log it out, and let's see if that actually works. I'll also console log out the response, just so we can see that chain going back and forth. And I'll refresh the page here. I'll go to that console, I'll scroll up, and we can see that this is the response object that comes back, which is why we couldn't have put that in there directly. It has a body, which has all the data inside of it. It has some headers and status, for example, at 200 means that it was an OK. And then we have our actual JSON, which is being logged on the next line, which has all of our data that we actually need inside of it. So that's pretty awesome, right? So for example, now what we can do is our error is coming from the fact that we can't take that entire object and put it in here. But what we can do, for example, is I can say JSON .stringify, and I can take data, or yeah, call it data, and I'll just give it a bit of spacing there, just so we can see that entire object in the DOM, or we can pull out specific values. And you can see when I refresh the page now, that does actually show, and we do have all of our data in there, and I could pull out specific keys and values if I wanted to. So it is actually finally working now, which is quite nice. And if I did want to pull out a value, I could say, for example, this is going to be like data.name, and then I can say maybe comma, and I'll do like data. I think there was a weight in there, data.weight. And look at that. We have ditto, and ditto weighs 40 units, whatever kind of units that is. I don't know is that heavy? Is that light? Not really sure. But there you have it. That's coming from the actual API, right? We did not code 40 or the name ditto anywhere. That's coming from the actual API response, which is pretty awesome. So let's take a look at this step by step, because it's so important to understand how this works. This is the same code that we have on the left over here. The only difference is that this is actually, we have to probably stringify this if we did want to do it, and we should probably do JSON response.json on this just to make sure that it actually works, as you saw, because in this case it's a JSON response, and we'd want to make sure to actually parse that as JSON. But basically the code that we saw earlier, this is a series of steps. Our component is going to mount. Data is going to be null, because that's what we start our useState as. We're going to then render out p with null, which is an empty p tag, immediately to the DOM right away, synchronously. We're going to schedule a useEffect, and we're going to send off our fetch request. We're going to wait for that to come back. In theory, this is going to do a chain of things with promises. We're going to chain those promises together. We're going to do .then, .json, .then, and then set data. But once we get that back, we're going to have our data, and we're going to set the state to the new data, and then we're going to re-render this component. So our set data here is going to set this data right here. We know that when that gets set, this function reruns, and then this is going to have the fresh, new, updated data to actually render to the DOM. That's exactly what we want. So that is the series of steps for pretty much all of data fetching. And it's very, very crucial to understand that that's how it works, because if you're wondering why you don't see this right away or what kind of errors you're getting, you want to make sure you follow this series of steps in your components to make sure it makes sense to you. And eventually you can trace it down to what's actually happening behind the scenes. Now, that's pretty much data fetching in React. Now, there are some caveats here. There's a few bugs with this code. There are some issues with it. And I won't go through those in this video because a lot of those are pretty nuanced, and we'll probably try to touch on a couple in the exercises, but eventually you'll start to see them as you work more with React. I want to focus on the core data fetching loop and idea so it all makes sense. And now, hopefully, when you go back to thinking about visually what's happening behind the scenes, this diagram makes sense. That was the goal of this video. We have a component, in this case it was called app, but we made a request out to get some data from some computer somewhere. It could be on our computer, it could be on our network, it could be across the world, doesn't really matter. It's going to search for that data on that computer. It's going to return with a response, and then we can do whatever we want with that response after it comes back. So in the meantime, we would need to know what is happening in that component before that data comes back. So what you probably notice is that before the data comes back, so if I switch back here and I quickly refresh the page, you'll see that for a split second, did I change something in here? Data.name, data.weight. Why did that not come back? Reading name of null. Oh, because I tried to put it directly in here. I see. So this is exactly what I wanted to show you, actually. So we need to make sure that data is not null if we want to do this. So one way to do this is using the kind of fancy conditional nullish. I forget the exact operator. Nullish, null, not null coalescing. It's the other one that checks to see if this is null. So if we do that, this will actually work. And you can see that if I refresh the page for a split second. Let me just super zoom in. It's not going to be there, and then it's going to flash in. It's not going to be there, and it's going to flash in. You see that there's only a comma there, which is what we're rendering on either side, and then it gets switched to that. Or you could do something like what you'll sometimes see is why we did conditional rendering in the previous video. You could see like data and data.name, and then you could say comma. I'll do height, I guess, data and data.height. And you would see that, which is basically the exact same thing here. And if I reload the page, you would see that that's what's coming through right here. Okay, so we need to make sure that we are, because otherwise we would be doing this, right? We'd be doing null.name, which we can't do. While it's null during the first render, it's only going to be populated asynchronously on the second time around that this gets rendered after this request come back. Because to start, it's going to be null. Okay. One way we could fix this is you could probably, instead of having to do that, you could just have like that as an object, empty object, and then you probably could just directly do data.name and data.weight because those are undefined anyways. It's a bit dangerous to rely on that and do that though, because maybe you have nested values, and if you have nested values, then this would for sure break. So I would highly encourage you to use these conditional renderings and not use this one. Use something like one of these, which is something you'll see pretty common. Okay, so I just want to mention before I go to the next slide that there are some subtle bugs with this still. For example, what you'll see, and I would encourage you to read the React documentation on data fetching, and we'll go through this in some of the exercises. But for example, if we have props and we use those props in here to actually make that fetch request, there might be like race conditions, which is maybe we make two quick fetch requests, one after the other. Maybe one comes back before the other for whatever reason, and we would run into a lot of data issues. So we have to be careful with things like that. So you have to guard against race conditions and a few other subtle things that are not immediately obvious. And frankly, 99.9% of the time, you're not going to even notice until that one bug is going to really bite you. But hopefully this kind of makes sense because this is really the core loop, right? We have some state. We're going to use an effect, usually on something like mount or some other variable changing. And we're going to make a fetch request out to some system. We're going to get back that data. We're going to reset the state, and then that state is going to re-render in the DOM, and we can actually see that data show up. Okay, so I want to show you one more thing, two more things before we wrap up this video. One is error handling. You have to be very careful when you're doing these requests because a lot of the time things can go wrong. When you're developing, maybe nothing goes wrong and you don't bother putting in an error condition. But when you deploy these applications, a lot of things can go wrong, right? Like imagine someone is using your application and you're assuming that there's always an internet connection, right? That would be a bad assumption because maybe I'm using your app and I suddenly go through like a subway tunnel and now I have no more internet. right? And then your entire app just crashes, right? That would be kind of terrifying if it was like a banking application. Like maybe I just sent a request to transfer some money and then the app crashes. I'd be like freaking out. I'd be like, oh my gosh, like what happened? Did it go through? Did it not go through? I see a bunch of red on the screen or an error. That would be very scary. You want to make sure that you catch those errors and you're pretty graceful and informative to the end users, and you should not rely on the console. I'm skipping kind of steps here, but don't show these in the console because no one's going to see the console except for developers most of the time, especially not on mobile. When was the last time you saw the developer console on Chrome or Firefox or Safari or something like that on mobile? Probably never. In fact, I'm trying to think, I don't even remember having to do that at all, except for mirroring it to my computer or something like that for testing some various web environments. So you want to, in the UI, visually show what's happening, whether it's a loading state or an error state to your users. Every data source handles responses differently, as well as the error. So this was a REST API, the response was in JSON. This might not be the case for every API. Also, the errors are totally different. We will see this in the exercises later. In this API, they handle errors very differently than in other APIs. Maybe you get back a 404 error, maybe you get back a 200 response, but if there's an error object, right? There's lots of different ways that an API designer can design their error messages. And you need to really read up the documentation and practice the API to make sure you know what's going on with it. You want to use the same state or create another state usually to actually handle the error cases, right? So what I'm saying is, like, if we need to re-render that page that the error happened on, you want to make sure that's in state so that gets re-rendered to the screen, just like if the data arrived correctly. You want to make sure if the data arrived incorrectly or there was no data or something like that, that is re-rendering correctly, and you can actually visually see what is happening without having to open up a console. Hopefully I nailed that in enough. I would encourage you to take a quick look at what happens if you try to fetch the wrong Pokemon name, for example. Like a Pokemon doesn't exist. We'll see that in the exercises together as well. But take a look preemptively. You'll maybe get some ideas as to what you could do to prevent errors if someone types in, for example, a search for the wrong Pokemon. Okay, so to finish off this video, I do want to mention that there are third-party libraries to do all this stuff and way more than I just showed you. I think it's extremely important to know the principles as to how to fetch data, namely the ones that we just went through, like these kinds of steps, right? Super important. However, in production and when you're building applications, both for yourself and kind of at an organization or something like that, most of the time you're going to be using a library for this feature. There's many reasons for this. One of the biggest reasons is that they handle all the edge cases for us. If you haven't heard that term before, that just means that there are a lot of really small cases that can go wrong, and you probably would never catch them when testing them normally, except under very extreme circumstances. And if you deploy your application to thousands of users, eventually one of those users is going to run into one of those extreme conditions, like I mentioned with the subway, for example, or any other kind of crazy situation that might pop up. You want to make sure that the library that you're using or that your logic handles all those cases, and it's quite a lot. So you want to make sure that you're not trying to recode it from scratch. People have already solved a lot of these problems before and made sure it's as optimal as possible. That said, there's a lot of also extra features that come with using these extra libraries. One of the things you probably notice with our code is every single time if I was to unmount and remount this component, for example, or even re-render this component if I forgot the onMount hook in the useEffect, this fetch request would go out every single time. In this case, it's even going out 2 times because we're in dev mode. So that might be a problem depending on how many of these fetch requests you have in your code. Maybe you have 2 or 3 or 4, right? And if you're always making that many requests, that's quite a lot. So what a lot of these libraries end up doing is they do caching, which means that if they see a request that's already been made before recently, it will not bother making the request, or it might make the request in the background and update the data, but it will actually return that response right away because you've already asked for that information literally just a few seconds ago. So it's very valuable for performance, makes everything feel very nice and smooth and snappy, and it actually saves the users a lot of data, as well as saves your servers from getting slammed too hard if you have lots of users. So some examples of some hooks that come with data fetching are things like useQuery and useSWR. There's many of them out there. I encourage you to look at them. I'm pretty sure I got this name right. There's just a whole bunch of them. Just look for like data fetching libraries in React, and you can kind of go through them both on NPM and on GitHub and take a look at some examples. I'm not going to go through the specific libraries in this course because each of them is just very similar to each other, and the fundamentals are what we are focusing on in this course to make sure you understand the principles of what's happening inside those libraries anyways. So that is what we already covered together. So to wrap this all up, effectively use a library when you're planning on putting something to production, because that is really what you're going to want to be doing for your actual end users, and to also save yourself from a bunch of headaches and refactoring of code if you don't take care of all the things like caching and edge cases and all the other features that you might end up needing. But it's really important to understand the actual principles of how this works behind the scenes to make sure that even when you do use these libraries, you can understand the flow of the data and exactly what might be happening behind the scenes in those libraries. So I hope that makes sense for you and you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we'll do in the next video together is go over a bunch of exercises, as I mentioned, to actually do things like I believe we'll do some caching and some other really fun stuff in there to actually get that working. And then we're going to follow that up with a custom hooks video where we can actually build on top of this idea and just kind of take it one step further, along with some other concepts as well. If you liked the video, I also set up a Patreon if you want to help out that way, or YouTube memberships and super thanks. So I'd appreciate even comments on the video or anything that you have seen yourself if you worked with these data fetching libraries, or if you have any recommendations for others watching this or for myself, I would love to hear them. But until the next set of exercises for data fetching in React, I will see you later.